Thanks for joining us today to talk about the science of soil health. Soil health is an important part of climate change solutions. Managing the soil health of working agricultural lands can draw existing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and make agricultural production more resilient to interference from climate change. Soil health can also improve farm profitability and contribute to cleaner water. As you'll hear today, federally funded research is essential to these efforts, as well as partnerships with farmers to integrate research advances into practices that are widely beneficial. The American Society for Microbiology supports funding for agricultural research and for policies that leverage the integral role of the soil microbiome in a well-functioning agro-ecosystem. ASM appreciates Congress's commitment to addressing the challenges of our changing climate. We hope that any economy-wide efforts to address climate change and the next Farm Bill will include further development and support to encourage effective soil health management on farms and ranches throughout the U.S. I would like to thank today's presenters for taking time out of their busy schedules to engage in this important conversation. Today, you'll hear from Mr. Justin Knopf. Mr. Knopf is a farmer near Salina, Kansas, where his family's farming heritage can be traced back to 5 generations. Working alongside his dad and brother, the Knopf family grows wheat, alfalfa, soybeans, grain sorghum, corn, and multi-species cover crops on 4,500 acres. They use a holistic approach to management rooted in values of faith and family with a multi-generational view. Their cropping system has been focused on continuous no-till with crop rotations for the past 15 years. The system protects the soil, allows its biology to thrive, is more resilient to extreme weather, and increases the carbon content in soils by sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Justin regularly engages with other farmers to learn and share information and has held leadership positions in several state and national agricultural organizations. Justin and his family are also featured in the documentary Rancher, Farmer, Fisherman, based on the book by Miriam Horn, which I encourage you to check out. Next, we'll have Dr. Charles Rice, who joins us from Kansas State University, where he is a distinguished professor of soil microbiology. Dr. Rice has conducted long-term research on soil organic matter dynamics, nitrogen transformations, and microbial ecology. Recently, his research has focused on soil and global climate change, including carbon and nitrogen emissions in agricultural and grassland ecosystems, and soil carbon sequestration and its potential benefits to the ecosystem. Dr. Rice's research has been supported by the U.S. Departments of Agriculture and Energy, as well as the National Science Foundation and others. He also serves on the board of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And last, we'll hear from Dr. Lakeisha Odom, the Scientific Program Director of Soil Health at the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. At FR, Dr. Odom pursues her commitment to promoting the use of innovative science, collective impact, and the development of public-private partnerships to tackle today's complex challenges in food and agriculture. She is also extremely committed to cultivating increased diversity in new generation of food and agriculture scientists. At FR, Dr. Odom spearheads scientific direction of the Soil Health Challenge area and manages a portfolio of projects that address issues in sustainable water management, plant efficiency, ecosystem services, crop pest and disease detection, and developing the next generation of food and agriculture leaders. There will be about 20 minutes for question and answers at the end of the presentations today. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll address them after the presentation. Now I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Mr. Justin Knuff.
Okay, I'll share my screen here. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to join you this afternoon from Central Kansas. Thank you for the introduction again and the opportunity to share just a little brief information about our farm and our approach to our cropping system and kind of some of our thoughts about soil biology, soil carbon from a farmer's perspective. My contact information is located on this slide. If you wish to jot it down, feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have any follow-up questions or would like to any more discussion. This first photo is actually a picture of my son and I. We spend a lot of time out checking fields and walking in across our landscape. And we not only pay attention to the stuff that's above ground, the plants are growing, but pay attention to what's below the soil surface, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about today. You can see in this photo some things that I look for is root structure. And then in the middle here, you can see an earthworm. That's Dr. Rice is a former professor of mine and a soil microbiologist. And so I think a lot about the biology, the life in our soil. And I can't see most of that biology with my naked eye, of course. So one of the indicators we use for healthy biology in a living system is the presence of earthworms. And so we spend a fair bit of time with a spade and looking for those things below ground. And that's what we're going to kind of talk about here as I share my perspective about soil health. It's about creating a habitat for living things and resiliency. Just you heard a little bit about our farm and the introduction. This is a photo of my family that we farm together. My brother and I represent the 5th generation to be farming here in this part of central Kansas. We are located 3 hours west of Kansas City. We farm in a dry land environment using continuous no-till practices and diverse crop rotation, growing the pretty typical crops for a farm in central Kansas. We're also integrating cover crops between our revenue crops, which we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Our approach to management is, as Amelia mentioned, a pretty holistic approach. We think obviously about economic returns for economic sustainability, and which is obviously necessary as we have a multi-generational viewpoint to be a viable business, a viable family business. But we also think about returns to human resources, natural resources, and our community resources. We believe all those things are essential, just as essential as the economic resources to operating a successful, sustainable, long-lasting business that spans generations. So when I was growing up farming, we farmed a lot differently than we do now. Our practices were much different. We didn't grow as many crops. We tilled and used implements to drag through the soil and churn it and till it to control weeds and create planting seed beds. When I was a student at K-State years ago, I began to learn more about how soils work. And I knew just from experiencing crop loss and failure from dry periods on our farm in central Kansas, we always are farming in a water-limited environment, that our ability to effectively capture water during a rainfall event in our soil versus having it leave the field. We want to capture and store it in our field and then have that water available when the plants need it. Our success or failure hinges dramatically on our ability to do that. And as rainfall events become more extreme, it becomes even more important that we're able to capture that water and store it for these longer drought periods that we may be experiencing. So resiliency is really the bottom line of what we think about a lot when we're talking about soil health. The reason we kind of started this journey in pursuing soil health when my brother and I returned to farm 15 plus years ago is just the observation about water and its necessity, along with some knowledge paired that I learned about how soils capture and store water and what's the important characteristics of a soil that enables it to do that. And then also just observation about our soils, the way we are managing them, we're turning it into a degraded resource. I've got 2 photos here. We have our rainy period where we get most of our moisture here in Kansas is in the spring, and a lot of those in kind of May through June, July, and those a lot of times will come as thunderstorms and can be intense rainfall events. 2019, we had a handful of events throughout the summer that measured 5+ inches at one time. And so we need a system that can be resilient, because that's a lot of force, a lot of impact. We need a system that can be resilient against that. As well, we also have very extended dry, hot periods. You can see the bottom picture is during one of those periods. That's a field that is unfortunate to see. There's soil being lost off of that field from wind erosion, damage being done to crops, and it's losing resiliency and a fragile, vulnerable environment there. So we wanted to move away. The trajectory we were on our farm was to move towards a degraded soil resource. I see soil as a pretty well non-renewable natural resource. And if it is renewable, it renews incredibly slowly. So we needed to protect that as we think about our holistic approach to maintaining our resources. Needed to change our trajectory. So we started doing some things. I'm going to just briefly walk through kind of 5 principles of things that we think about in our cropping system. Not get into a lot of details, but just give you a few glimpses of what this looks like and as we approach how to grow crops on our farm. First principle we utilize is minimizing disturbance. And these are all things to improve our resiliency, both economically and agronomically, to improve our soil resource, to capture carbon, and to promote biology in our soil, biology that's going to help partner with the plants and the rhizosphere and make those plants more resilient during extreme conditions. So this first principle is minimizing disturbance. And this is simply pretty straightforward. We want to disturb our soils both physically and chemically as little as possible. We absolutely use things to fine tune the system and utilize herbicides and science and technology in our cropping system. But we want to minimize those disturbances and the physical disturbances, especially, as much as possible. And I just think about this as we are creating a habitat for living things in our soil. I think about the habitat that we as living things appreciate, and it's some of it is stability. We like to have a stable home to return to that's not being blown around or disrupted. We have tornadoes here, and it causes a tremendous amount of disruption. That's not something that is conducive to stable environment for living. And so I think about how to create that stable environment for living things in the soils that we are stewarding. This is a photo of the seed slice that our seeder makes. You can see those are actually triticale seeds there in the seed furrow. So that's the only amount of disturbance that we are doing throughout the year. The rest of the year, the soil is not disturbed. And this small amount of disturbance is what is necessary to place seeds into that soil. So we're leaving the residue, the biomass from the crop, from the previous crop after harvest time on top of the soil surface at all times, and then seeding through that directly and placing the seed into the soil at the right depth and moisture, hopefully. Next principle is keeping the soil armored all year round. This is a photo from a cornfield from last year at emergence. The residue you see there is from a triticale cover crop that we grew the prior winter and then terminated right about at planting time. And you can see there's a little soil exposed right there where the planter went through. It disturbs a little bit more than our seeder does that we seed that triticale with. So there's a little soil that is exposed there, but you can see in the picture on the right, after things kind of blow around a little bit and move with the rainfall and those plants grow, we're back to a completely covered environment. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One, to protect the soil from erosion. When those intense rainfall events happen, all those raindrops have a tremendous amount of kinetic energy. And if they're hitting the soil surface directly, they are exploding soil structure and reducing our ability to capture the water effectively. I want those water droplets, those rainfall, the kinetic energy from that rain droplet to land on top of the residue and then just very gently seep down to the soil below that and enter it effectively. This also makes big differences for our soil and plant canopy temperatures in the hot part of the summer. We've measured up to about a 10 to 15 degree soil temperature difference when we have the soil armored and protected. And like this, versus if it is exposed to the direct sunlight. And so 15 degrees going from 85 degree soil temperature to 100 or 105 degree temperature is a big difference for the plants and the living things in the soil. Third principle that we are working towards, this is a continual improvement process, is increasing diversity. And I think it's just a general observation that life appreciates diversity, and ecosystems, a biological system, appreciates diversity, and it makes it more resilient. Our soils here in Kansas and much of the high plains, central plains, were formed under a prairie system, and that prairie has tremendous diversity within it. And as we've moved to more monoculture systems, for good reasons, because we need to grow food and do it efficiently, that has led us to a monoculture system predominantly. However, we've given up some diversity, so we're looking at niches and places that we can return that diversity into our cropping system. And one of the ways we're doing that is through cover crops that are grown. These are crops specifically just grown between our grain crops, only to add diversity and cover for the soil and roots into the soil. We're not harvesting them other than perhaps putting some animals out to graze on them. So all that returns back to the soil after they are done. This is a mix we grew last year. I think there's 8 or 10 species here. Right in front, you can see this little plant with a flower on it is a flax plant, actually. And it's a very non-assuming plant, but I put it in all our mixes because it's an excellent host for mycorrhizal fungi. And so since this is a microbiology association that is sponsoring this today, I thought maybe I should mention that. So mycorrhizal fungi are great at going out and colonizing plant roots, and then sending out hyphae to go get phosphorus and deliver that phosphorus to the plants that the plants can't get by themselves. So we're incorporating that flax in there to create a host and food and a living environment for that fungi that we want to have present in our soils. Next principle is a continuous living root. And so this is something that is newer to us in our management system, our cropping system, the last several years. And you can see here where I'm seeding, running our seeder through green plants that are alive and will be sprayed out very shortly or right about the same time. And I look at this as kind of a handoff. All that biology in the soil needs food to eat. And so when there's living roots, that rhizome is a constant interaction, exchange of enzymes and carbohydrates and proteins, and those fungi, bacteria, and living things in the soil depend on those living roots to eat. And the plants depend on them, I believe, as well, to carry things to them. So trying to create a living root presence to better feed the biology in the soil. And again, this is about creating resilience, a living soil, and we're also lengthening our ability to capture carbon through photosynthesis by allowing these cover crops to grow longer before planting our grain crops, and helping with weed suppression. So there's several benefits we're doing there. The tricky part is not utilizing too much water before, and if we're in a really dry period. That's the trade-off and the tricky part to try to best manage. Last principle that we're working towards, and this is very brand new on our farm. There's a number of farms that have done this that are far ahead of us on this path, but that's the integration of livestock. So this is a picture of that multi-species cover crop, and we are strip grazing this, which means we don't just turn the cattle out on the whole field, but we put up hot wires and move them about every day or every second day to try to more intentionally utilize and manage the animal impact on this cropping system. So the idea here, one, is to get some economic returns in short term from that cover crop by being able to offset some feed costs. These are not my cattle. Actually, I'm partnering with a friend and neighbor of mine who knows much more about livestock than I do. I don't have the management capability at this point, to take that under our own management. So we're partnering with a neighbor and friend to do this. So he's paying me some feed, some some money to be able to go out and harvest with animals some feed out of this field. Now, we only remove about 40 to 50% of the plant material there, and we want to leave the vast majority of it there to protect the soil and do these other 4 things that we've talked about. But there's also other benefits to me as the farmer for integrating livestock. Again, back to thinking about our prairie system, the bison herds were always a ruminant animal that were interacting with the soils, and we've kind of taken the animals off the landscape. So we're thinking about the impact to returning those animals to the landscape, the interaction of the biology of the rumen with the biology of the soil, and then again, just that economic opportunity that it presents there. I mentioned about our holistic approach to management and what we think about, and I think when I think holistically about soil health practices and this endeavor, it's not only a benefit to my family and our farming operation, but our community as well. And so there's a few things that I observe as our farming systems hopefully move more in this direction, that are benefits not only to me as the farmer, but to my community and overall society. The water quality, having cleaner water that's leaving our fields and hopefully reducing some of the impact the negative impacts we're having on rivers and the Gulf of Mexico. And there's room for improvement there. The soil, I've talked about that plenty, is maintaining and improving it is a very important resource. We're so fortunate in North America to have some of the most productive soils in the world. Taking carbon dioxide out of the air through photosynthesis and storing that in the soil. Carbon is the biological energy, or the energy source for the biological system, the energy currency, if you will. So having more carbon in my soil makes it more resilient and improved. And then the economic resiliency for the communities. There's other opportunities, direct marketing and small businesses that I've noticed that are popping up and interacting with the farms that people are interested in the practices that they're utilizing. Just to kind of take home broader messages for the audience here, the support for applied research is critical. These are very long-term investments being made on our farms and many others. It's sometimes difficult to measure or receive a short-term economic benefit from some of these practices. And so it's more long-term investment that are yielding societal benefits. However, that long-term investment is, if we're making those, we need to be pretty confident in the decisions we're making. And that's why more high quality and regionally focused, because this is so regionally based on what practices will work based on each climate, that it needs to be regionally based. So that long-term investment into our farms and into research to help me understand and better measure how these practices are impacting our cropping system and give farmers more confidence, so we can hopefully improve the rate of adoption and the scale of adoption as we have more knowledge to be confident to understand the specific numbers at how these practices impact our cropping system regionally. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I will be here at the end for Q&A.
Great, Justin. Well, thanks a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about more the science aspects, but Justin made a great introduction, and so I'm just going to build on what he mentioned more from the measurement science standpoint. So again, I'm going to talk about soil health and the microbiome. And so just to reiterate what Justin mentioned about the erosion and soil degradation, this is some information just illustrating in 2017 as an example. The national average erosion rate was about 2.5 tons per acre per year. As Justin mentioned, it's not really a renewable resource. The formation is on the order of 0.1 to 0.5 tons. We talk about tolerable erosion, but the question is it really tolerable when we're losing a lot more of our natural resource than can form in that period? And in some regions in 2017, Iowa and others, during floods or wind erosion, they've lost up to 30 to 40 tons. So definitely we're not forming soil. And this just shows some visual examples. Actually, this pictures here are from Wichita, Kansas in 2012 during the drought. So this could have been pictures from the 1930s. But the important thing, as Justin mentioned, is that carbon that we've lost from the original prairie, on order around 50% of our carbon or organic matter out of the soils due to cultivation from prior practices. So we definitely need to renew and regenerate some of our natural resources. The other thing that's happening is climate change and really the extreme events. This is two pictures from Kansas. Again, this is from 2012, where they had 3 years of drought in western Kansas. You couldn't even grow a crop, and so you expose the soil even with some of our best practices. The other picture here is from 2018, Manhattan, Kansas. This occurred around Labor Day. We were actually 30% below normal up until September 2nd. And on the 3rd, we ended up with 10 inches of rainfall in about 4 hours a period. And as a result, you see this. So actually that year was normal, but the distribution was not very good. And so that makes it hard to grow crops, but also protect our soils and have the resiliency that Justin talked about. So as you gather from this webinar briefing is that we would argue that part of this resiliency resides in the soil. And just a little factoid here is that a teaspoon of soil contains over 1 billion bacteria, yet we can only culture about 1% of those bacteria species. We know much more about the DNA, but we can't grow a lot of them. So it's a vast unknown territory in that soil. And so that's some of the things that we're trying to do, ASM and myself as a soil microbiologist, to understand that. But they're all interconnected, and Justin kind of talked a little bit about this. Is what I call my holy trinity of soil health. It's based on organic matter or carbon, as Justin indicated. It's the food for the microorganisms. It's like going into a candy store, that sugar and carbohydrates, that food source. That feeds the microbes and how active they are. But there's also part of the Trinity is there's an interaction between soil structure, the aggregation that Justin talked about for allowing water to infiltrate in the soil. And the more carbon you have more microbial activity. And then some of those microbes, the mycorrhizal fungi that Justin talked about, helps to build soil structure and aggregates. And it also protects and holds more carbon. If you have those three things, then you're going to be able to capture the water better and infiltrate it in the soil and use that water during those dry periods. It provides a better rooting habitat. Along with carbon in that organic matter is nutrients. And so it's a resource, nutrient resource for those plants growing on it. And that's what Justin is taking advantage of, is those nutrients in the organic matter as they released by the microbes to feed that plant system. So just to highlight a couple research projects to illustrate how the science is trying to help. We have an NSF EPSCoR project to look at the microbiome of aquatic plant and soil systems across Kansas. Kansas is a unique laboratory because the precipitation gradient goes from 40 inches down to about 14 inches across the state. In fact, there's a greater precipitation gradient across the state of Kansas than it is from the Kansas border to the East Coast in Washington, D.C., where some of you are located. The other thing is that Kansas was once the part of the largest grasslands, tallgrass prairie, and we're looking at the effect of native prairie ag systems on the microbiome across that precipitation gradient. And just a little bit of information. What we found is across this gradient, and looking at native prairie, what you see here is microbial biomass of that surface soil. And that would include the mycorrhizal fungi. So the more microbial biomass, the more better soil structure or aggregation that you have. That allows that water to infiltrate into the soil. And what you see here is a diagram showing that fungal hyphae helping to form that soil structure. What you should notice here, what's circled in blue, is the ag systems. Because of the conventional tillage, they have been highly disturbed, and we've lost that ability, that soil structure and that ability to absorb those intense rainstorm events. And then what we're doing here at K-State then is looking at some of the practices that Justin talked about, no-till, other practices that we can reform those that soil structure, and we are doing that. And so to be, keys to a climate resilient or healthy soil, one is the focus should be on soil health. And as Justin mentioned, disturbance is not a good home, or provides a good home for those microbes. And so we look at minimum tillage and no-till being the prime example. But the other thing that is, how can we intensify the systems? And the intensification isn't necessarily meaning putting on more inputs of water and nutrients and energy. It's how can we be more efficient with the water that we have, with the rainfall or irrigation? How can we be more efficient with the nutrients, either coming from the soil or from external inputs? And with continuous cover, as Justin called his soil armor, then that allows us to conserve that water and allows us to do double cropping and cover crops. Again, that's taking carbon from the atmosphere, putting into the soil, improving soil health, and feeding those microorganisms. But the other key component in this resilient system is really diversification that Justin highlighted, not only with cover crops, but even crop rotations, having corn, wheat, soybean, sorghum rotations, adding more diversity in there. That helps to provide some weed and pest resistance or control, but also then provides a healthier microbial community. So one of the things that we're doing, and Justin is part of this, is that we have taking this research that we're generating in the lab and in the field, and then working with on-farm research. This is a collaboration between multiple organizations, but we're developing the metrics, the measurements that Justin wants or needs to understand improving soil health. So it's not just putting the practice, but it's then what are the right kind of metrics for that. And this is just an example where we have this on-farm research strip trials replicated so we can collect research data. And in this case, this farmer is looking at the impact of no-till and then no-till plus cover crops. And what you see here is the changes in organic matter, carbon, the biology, and water stable aggregates. And you can see where we've implemented, there's the cover crops on top of the no-till. We're starting to see some of the changes. And this is just over a 3-year period, but as Justin mentioned, it really takes 5, 7, or even 10 years to start to see major changes in improving soil health, but we're trending the right way. And part of this project is not only to collect the research data, but is to disseminate it. And so the extension activities are really important. And just in 3 years, we've reached over 400 farmers, ag consultants, and the public through these field days, this on-farm research. And then just recently, we received a USDA grant to look at this whole combination of water efficiency, nutrient efficiency, and soil health. And this is a 5-year, $10 million project that encompasses the Southern Great Plains to look at how we can increase precipitation, nitrogen, and at the same time enhancing soil health. So we're looking at some of these principles that Justin talked about, increasing diversity rotations, looking at cover crops that are water efficient to provide that living root system, but then improving the resiliency of these systems. And then I might mention a couple other items here just to support the research, that in 2018, the National Academies came out with a Science Breakthrough 2030 report on future of ag research needs. And, you know, the 5 themes of that report are shown here, but the 2 bolded items talk about soil systems. And one is we need more research to identify and harness the soil microbiome to produce nutrients and increase nutrient availability. And in fact, I'm working with 2 companies that have contacted me last month to look at the mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria in the rhizosphere to enhance nutrient availability and to improve soil health. And of course, then we need the outreach, technology transfer to the farmers like Justin that could use that information. And then lastly, the National Academy held a workshop last month to look at how do we develop a more dynamic soil information system. So the measurements that we are taking, farmers are collecting, NGOs are collecting, how can we put this into a comprehensive system for the United States so that it can be applied and deliver decision support tools for people like Justin. So again, just a summary, we're looking at reintroducing complexity, and Justin highlighted that very well. How do we increase efficiency? But we really need the new tools in the toolbox, sensors to detect water, microbial activity, artificial intelligence, robotics. We got remote sensing now with drones. How do we acquire all that data and manage it, deliver the support tools? And then as Justin reiterated, that we really need sustained investments in research to develop a more efficient system, a farming system for this country. And with that, I would like to thank you and move on to the next presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate Justin and Chuck's comments. I feel as though they've set me up for success. So as Amalia mentioned, I'm Lakeisha Odom with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and I'll share a little bit about what we see from the funding perspective, both the trends in the non-federal and federal spaces, what we're seeing in private sector, and also a little bit of information around what FAR is prioritizing as a funding organization. So for those of you that may be unfamiliar with our organization, the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research was created through the 2014 Farm Bill to create public-private partnerships to increase research funding in agriculture, food, nutrition spaces, and to tackle intractable issues in agriculture. And so we look at ways in which we connect funders, researchers, farmers, looking for those next frontier pioneering research spaces, how we can capture agriculture innovation to provide every person access to affordable food, nutrition, and produced on thriving farms. So the way that we do that is we focus in 6 key challenge areas, which are strategic priority areas. And as you can see, FAR has been identified as one of, soil health has been identified as one of FAR's key strategic scientific priorities. We are looking at ways in which soil science research and technology transfer can be better coordinated, evaluated, and implemented. So in preparation for this slide deck, one of the things that I saw that really struck me was a recent quote from NSF, where it's talking about scientists need a better understanding of soil systems and how they play critical roles in supporting societies around the world. And that, to me, echoes what Chuck mentioned around just the lack of information we have around what's happening under our feet. We know more. I think everyone's heard this quote. We know more about what's happening in the heavens above than we do below our feet. And that's a really accurate statement. And at FAR, we recognize that in order to really have a strategic portfolio of soil health research, we need to understand factors that affect productivity and profitability, which I think you heard as Justin shared, and looking at ways in which we can impact resilience and ensure that farmers and ranchers can be resilient to future challenges around weather conditions, drought, rainfall, temperature fluctuations, all the things that my colleagues on this call have shared with you today. To date, FAR has funded approximately $30 million in the Soil Health Challenge area with over 15 partnering organizations, and the spaces in which we focus are around resiliency and adaptation, site-specific decision-making, farmer well-being, and novel pathways to adoption. We also look at ways in which we can improve diversity and inclusion and support UN Sustainability Development Goals. So now to look at, I will not do as thorough a job as Dr. Rice has done in sharing the importance of microbial activity to soil health, but at FAR, we recognize the importance of microbiome research in the soil health space, in that it affects, as he said, his main three areas, as well as the 5 principles that Justin shared. And so just looking at how they're so crucial in the promotion of soil health, soil-based microorganisms are so crucial in the promotion of soil health, quality, fertility, all factors that contribute heavily to quality and yield of agricultural practices. So looking not just within my own soil portfolio, but looking across several of our other challenge areas, to date, FAR has funded approximately $4.4 million in research that addresses things under that soil health or microbiome category. And I will not mention this in great detail, but I did also reference the event that Chuck did mention around the National Academy's workshop, and some of the considerations that are bubbling out of that, I think could be really helpful in informing where we might invest next. I did try to do a little bit of a high-level assessment of what's happening in that federal space. So in going through USDA NIFA's system and just doing a snapshot search of soil health and microbiome-focused projects, what I found is that there are quite a few projects in those spaces, but they range quite widely, from anything from microbial solutions for sustainable agroecosystems to training programs to looking at the plant-soil microbiome interaction. So while there is work going on in this space, I think that what Chuck's presentation highlighted is there's still quite a bit of need for research. And looking at not just USDA, but NSF, we found that there are a number of projects that do focus on that soil health microbiome, but it's not as heavily invested in as USDA. And then the last space that I looked at was in NIH, looking at there's a current microbiome interagency working group, and there are over 21 federal agencies connected in some way. And so this was pulled to show some evidence of which organizations have some research interest around those spaces in agriculture, human, terrestrial, across the board. But at least you can see that a number of organizations have some work happening in these spaces. The question that I would have as I work through looking at this is, are they coordinated efforts? This working group is helping to pull them together. There are other groups that are really helping to coordinate these efforts. But from a non-federal space, I think there's always additional room to understand and connect these efforts and make them a bit more collaborative. In the private sector, we're seeing a lot of interest around the value of microorganisms as they can provide important plant traits, for example, or looking at ways in which they can affect extreme weather or emerging pathogens. So there are, as we move into a call for more precision-based agricultural recommendations, there's a more interest in the private sector around the role that microorganisms could play in supporting that. And so to that end, there's quite a bit of interest in private sector opportunities around resistance development of pathogens and pests against chemical treatments, for example, or looking at ways in which microbes can support plants in addressing things like a drought as an abiotic stressor. And there's also some space in the organic food sector looking at adoption of integrated pest management and what microbes can do in those spaces. So there is some interest. And one of the things that I did find in preparing for this is that there is growth in the market from the private sector. And as an organization that looks for public-private opportunities for connection, seeing this interest and this increase in the industry side reveals that there will be opportunities potentially to support research findings. So I'll leave you with this, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A right after. The spaces where I see the most opportunity are, as I mentioned, in public-private partnership development. There's quite a bit happening in the federal spaces, but I believe there's also a bit of opportunity in those private sector or NGO spaces to continue to support additional research. There are always questions around data needs in the space, how we can improve productivity, specifically addressing margins that would lower risk, looking for opportunities in crop diversity or water quality, for example. And then the other piece that came to me during the presentation is also under research, needing a space for longer funded projects, because the challenge in a lot of these spaces is that a 3 to 5 year project, I don't know that it would actually capture or allow for enough time to see the changes and record the changes needed to really give clear recommendations. So another thing that might be something that could be recommended is identifying opportunities to fund longer studies, such that you could have a more comprehensive, systematic look at these systems instead of taking these snapshots. It takes, while microbial diversity and communities can shift quickly, if you really want to attribute it to a particular treatment, you do need longer term studies. And a lot of funding opportunities, even in our own organization, are based on 3 to 5 years. So giving maybe additional longer funding opportunities, I think, could be something that could also be something that is an area for potential. I think that I will pause now because I want to make sure we leave time for questions. I'll stop my share, but I'll leave my camera on because I think we're going to start talking to everybody now.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Dr. Odom, Dr. Rice, and Mr. Knopf. Justin, do you want to put your camera on as well? There we go. All right. So those presentations were amazing. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to talk to everyone on the webinar today. We did have some questions submitted ahead of time, so I'm going to touch on a couple of those first, since we have about 5 minutes. There are some additional questions in the chat, and we will follow up with everyone who attended after this with some additional information and responses to your questions. So I'll start with Justin. As agricultural research provides farmers with more options for pursuing stewardship and profitability, we want to ensure as many farmers as possible understand what these practices can do for their operations and communities. What is preventing more farmers from adopting similar practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think about that a fair bit, actually. I think it's really important, as Dr. Rice highlighted, that the access to the information is widely disseminated. So I think sometimes that can be a tricky piece. This RAIN project that Dr. Rice alluded to is going to have a lot of really, I think, valuable information. So making sure that is put out in the countryside. But I think a bigger hurdle or holdback is these changes, as Dr. Rice also alluded to, are complex. There's a lot of things to think through. It's a different mindset approach. And so I think that, in combination with some of the sociological things we know about average farm age, a lot of farmers are towards the tail end of their career. And so these are long-term investments that are complex to think about and take time to get returns from and to see that impact in the soil and our resiliency. So I think that's another reason that is sometimes overlooked, is it's difficult if you're at the if you only maybe have 5 or 7 years left in your career, it's difficult to want to make these types of big sweeping changes that bring a lot of extra complexity. So I think there's obviously a lot of dynamics at play, but I think things that will help are this research partnership between critical research partners and on-farm research, farmers being able to see these practices and the impacts of them in their own communities, on their neighbors' farms or their own farms, and being able to interact with other farmers and learn from each other as we all try to move in the direction of resiliency. That learning aspect from each other is important, and having regionally focused research locations on farms with these critical research partners is a great venue for that.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Mary Lee, I might just jump in because I saw one of the questions that relate to that. Kale asked about the how widely adopted limited tillage and cover practices are, and so there's no-till or reduced till is probably in Kansas at least is probably 70-80%. I think the no-till is around. I just was looking up some numbers in Kansas or in the region. It's around 40 or 50%. But part of it is that isn't continuous no-till. And then the other thing is cover crop adoption is probably only around 10 or 15%, although there's a lot of talk about it. And you've got innovators like Justin that have jumped on to these practices. But I think what we need now that we're trying to do is collect the data, so that we can show what are the improvements, the metrics like improved aggregation or water infiltration, so that we can take Justin's information and translate that to other farmers to help demonstrate that these practices are making some real changes.
That's great, and there's a data related question in the Q&A box as well, and I'll direct this one to Dr. Odom first, but I think anyone can feel free to jump in to respond. So the question is about the most common data storage and management solutions for soil microbiome data, and what are the biggest headaches in data management? And I think I would add to that, like also in data collection as well, from the farmer and researcher perspective.
So I'll share the headaches because those are the ones that come to my mind. Is that the information, the systems in which data is collected, they are not compatible. The information is collected in different formats. And so then when you try to answer these larger systematic questions that may require multiple databases, then it's almost impossible to do that, or it requires so much cleaning up of the data on the front end that it's really challenging to do so. So I would say that finding ways to integrate data more effectively, integrate systems more effectively, and then I wouldn't necessarily know if I wanted to propose a data protocol, but some kind of components that would be consistent in the way the information will be collected. I think that's a lot of the headache that I hear around even wanting to answer some of these high-level systems questions that Justin mentioned. You need to have systems that collect the data in such a way that you can extrapolate out. And it's really challenging to do that. I don't know, Chuck, if you would add anything to that.
Yeah, and the workshop report will be coming out later this month or early May on that. And then there's a group of us going to hopefully write a paper to submit to Science or Nature in the sense to help design the protocol. But Lakeisha is right. It's the volume of data, the complexity, it's coming from different sources. It might be federal government supported. It might be state government. It might be NGOs, TNC, Nature Conservancy, and others are collecting data too. So how do you get all this disparate information compiled and then integrated so then it's available to the users? And that's really, really difficult. And that's one of the things the National Academy Workshop was trying to do, is maybe to not design how to collect it, but how do you collate it and then integrate it and make it user friendly. And honestly, the government doesn't have the funds to develop the system, nor is the storage capacity for the vast amounts of data. And it's not just the microbiome data, but it's the other ancillary data, where that data was collected from. If we're talking about soils, what are the soil chemical and physical properties that interact with that microbiological data? So that's really critical.
Great, thank you. So we are pretty close to time, and I wanted to make sure that I shared your contact information one last time with everyone who is on the call. So let me bring that up. Here we go. So thank you again for a robust conversation today. We really do appreciate your time, both from our presenters and the attendees. We will follow up within a few days with a link to the recording so that you can rewatch it, or if there's anyone that you'd like to share it with, you can feel free to share the link. In the meantime, feel free to contact me or to contact any of our speakers with specific questions. And we will try to follow up with the questions that we did miss in the chat with the group as well. So thank you again and have a wonderful day.